Jonathan Hale reached the airport before sunrise. The halls were quiet and cool, and only a few travelers moved around with sleepy eyes. He liked mornings like this, because everything felt calm before the world fully woke up. Jonathan walked with steady steps. Not fast, not slow, just confident and relaxed. Anyone passing him would think he was an ordinary man going to an ordinary job. No one would guess he was the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the country. He did not dress like a rich man. He did not show off. And he never traveled with assistants or guards. He believed true power did not need to shout. It only needed to act. Jonathan was flying today to close an important partnership with international investors. The meeting could change the future of his company. But he was calm because he knew he was fully prepared. He checked in online hours earlier, and his ticket clearly said Seat 1A, a VIP first-class seat. He chose it because he needed space to work on his laptop and review final notes. But he never imagined that this simple seat would start a chain of events no one on the plane would forget. He entered the long jet bridge with his small leather bag. He didn't need more luggage because he liked to travel light. A sharp-looking flight attendant stood at the plane's entrance, greeting passengers without warmth. Her eyes looked tired and her smile looked forced. When Jonathan stepped forward, she barely looked at him. Seat. She asked quickly. 1A. He answered politely. She paused, confusion flickering across her face, as if his answer didn't make sense to her. Are you sure, sir? She asked, her tone a little sharp. Yes, Jonathan replied, still calm. She took his boarding pass and scanned it again, even though nothing was wrong with it. Her eyes narrowed a bit, sir. This area is for VIP and premium passengers only, she said quietly. Jonathan felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. But he didn't show it. I understand, he said. I purchased a VIP seat. She didn't move aside. Instead, she waved over another attendant, a tall man who walked with an attitude. He glanced at Jonathan as if he had already made a decision about him. What's the issue? He asked. The first attendant leaned toward him and whispered something Jonathan couldn't hear. The man nodded quickly and stepped forward. Crossing his arms, sir? We can't let you sit here, he said. Your seat is in the back. Some passengers nearby turned their heads. Surprised by the tone, Jonathan stayed calm. There must be a mistake, he said, offering the boarding pass again, but the man didn't look at it. He simply pointed toward economy, moved to the back. Please, he said, louder this time. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. One woman shook her head slowly. Jonathan felt frustration rising, but he controlled it. Can you explain why I can't sit in the seat I paid for? He asked firmly. The male attendant shrugged. This section is for VIP guests, he repeated. So you need to move. Jonathan took a slow breath. He knew exactly what they were assuming. They looked at his simple clothes, his quiet presence, his skin. They made a judgment without knowing a single thing about him. But Jonathan never believed in shouting or arguing. Instead, he said calmly, I'd like to speak to your cabin manager. Both attendants frowned, annoyed that he didn't obey. But they called the manager anyway a few moments later. A woman arrived with a controlled smile. She looked at Jonathan the same way the others had. Sir, this is a premium cabin, she said, as if repeating a rule to a stubborn child. Jonathan lifted his boarding pass again. This is my seat, he said softly. The manager finally took the pass and scanned it. Her expression shifted slightly, but she still looked doubtful. Jonathan reached into his bag and took out his tablet. He opened a document, turned the screen around, and held it toward her. She leaned in to read it. Her face changed immediately. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and a soft gasp escaped before she could stop it. Because she was staring at a contract signed by Jonathan Hale, a partnership agreement between her airline and Hale Dynamics. And right under his name was the title Chief Executive Officer. The manager swallowed hard. Her voice dropped. Sir, I didn't know, she said, but Jonathan only looked at her with calm eyes. This is how you treat your VIP guests when you think no one is watching, he said quietly. The attendants behind her froze, their faces draining of color. Passengers whispered softly, shocked. The cabin felt tense and silent. Everyone realized something big had just shifted. Jonathan stepped back slightly. "Call the full crew," he said gently. "We need to talk." And the entire plane braced itself, because no one knew what was coming next. The cabin felt heavier than before as the manager hurried to gather the entire crew. Passengers pretended not to stare, but their eyes followed every small movement. Some whispered behind hands, some leaned slightly forward, and some simply watched with silent curiosity. Everyone knew something serious was unfolding, and no one wanted to miss a second of it. Jonathan stood near his seat, calm and steady. He didn't look angry. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't try to scare anyone. But his silence carried weight, the kind that made people straighten their backs without thinking. When the full crew gathered in front of him, the manager cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, the staff is here," she said softly. Jonathan nodded once. "Good," he replied. "We can begin." The attendants who had spoken to him earlier stood at the front. Avoiding eye contact, their confidence from before had vanished, replaced by fear and confusion behind them. The rest of the crew waited with worried faces. Most did not know what happened, but they could feel the tension clearly. Jonathan looked at each one of them slowly, his voice calm and steady. "Before I say anything, I want to know something," he said. "Do you all believe that every passenger on this plane deserves respect?" His question hung in the air, simple yet sharp. Every crew member nodded immediately. "Yes, sir," the manager answered, her voice shaky. Jonathan nodded again. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, "because today, respect was not given." He turned his eyes to the two attendants who confronted him earlier. They shifted uncomfortably, their hands tightening nervously in front of them. "Would you like to explain why you refused to let me sit in the seat I paid for?" he asked gently, not loud, not harsh, but the question cut like cold wind. The male attendant swallowed hard. "Sir, we thought there was a mistake," he said. "What mistake?" Jonathan asked. The attendant hesitated. We didn't see you as a VIP guest." Jonathan held his gaze. "And why is that?" he asked. The attendant couldn't answer. His eyes dropped to the floor, and his silence told the truth clearer than words. Jonathan turned to the female attendant. "You scanned my boarding pass twice," he said softly. "Why?" She looked trapped. I thought someone else booked the seat," she replied in a weak voice. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "And did you treat any other passengers the same way?" "No, sir," she whispered. Passengers were watching closely now, their reactions shifting from curiosity to anger. Jonathan took a slow breath and looked at the manager. "I showed you my boarding pass," he said. "But you still tried to move me." The manager's eyes filled with regret. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. Jonathan lifted a hand gently to stop her from speaking further. "This is not about a single mistake," he said. "This is about how you treat people when you think they have no power." The crew looked down. Realizing the truth of his words, Jonathan continued, "I run a company with 3,000 employees," he said. "I expect my team to treat every person with respect, no matter how they look or what seat they bought." He paused for a moment, letting the message settle deep into the air. Suddenly, a passenger from row 2 raised his hand slightly. "Sir," he said softly, "I saw what happened, and it was wrong." Another passenger nodded. "You handled it with more dignity than most people could," she added. Jonathan gave them a small nod of thanks, but his focus remained on the crew. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. He opened the airline partnership file once more. "This airline works with my company," he said, "and this flight is part of our evaluation team's regular routes." The crew's eyes widened. They realized the weight of what was happening. Jonathan continued, "We evaluate customer treatment, staff professionalism, and the airline's commitment to fairness." His voice was still calm, but the air around him felt electric. "And today, what I saw does not match the values this airline claims to stand for." The cabin manager stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Sir, please, give us another chance," she said. Jonathan shook his head gently. "Another chance comes through accountability, not excuses," he said. He tapped a button on his phone and lifted his eyes to the crew. "I'm contacting the corporate office," he said quietly. Gasps spread through the cabin. The female attendant's eyes filled with tears. The male attendant's face turned pale. They both understood what was coming. Jonathan sent a short message with a firm yet calm expression. Then he looked up and spoke 7 words that echoed through the plane. "Your roles on this flight end today." Passengers froze. Shocked, the crew stood completely still. No one spoke, no one moved. The moment felt unreal. Like time had stopped for everyone, Jonathan stepped back into his VIP seat. Calm as ever, but the flight had changed forever. And every person on board knew this was just the beginning. The cabin stayed silent after Jonathan's announcement. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to shift. Even the hum of the plane felt softer, almost respectful. The 2 attendants who mistreated him looked frozen in place. Their faces pale, the manager stood stiffly. Trying to control her breathing, Jonathan sat calmly in seat 1A, opening his laptop as if this was just another morning. But everyone knew the situation was far from normal. Jonathan typed quickly, sending a detailed message to the airline's corporate office. He described the incident clearly and respectfully. Not adding anger, not adding emotion, he simply wrote the truth. Then he attached evidence from the partnership documents that confirmed his identity and role. He ended the message with a simple request: "Please call me immediately." Then he closed the laptop gently. He knew what would happen next. The airline's leadership took his evaluations very seriously, and a CEO's message was never ignored. A flight attendant who had not been involved earlier stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, may I offer you something to drink?" she asked softly. Jonathan looked at her and gave a polite nod. "Yes, thank you," he said. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared his drink, doing everything as carefully as possible. She set it down gently on his tray. "If you need anything, please let me know," she added, her voice respectful yet nervous. Jonathan thanked her again. He could see the fear in her eyes. But he knew she wasn't the problem. She had not joined in the disrespect. She was simply caught in the storm around her a few minutes later. Jonathan's phone buzzed loudly in the quiet cabin. Passengers turned their eyes toward him again. Jonathan answered calmly. It was the airline's vice president of operations calling from corporate headquarters. He placed the phone to his ear, his voice steady. "Jonathan, we're so sorry," the VP said immediately. "We were not aware this situation happened." Jonathan leaned back in his seat. "I'm not concerned about myself," he said softly. "I'm concerned about your passengers who don't have the voice or status to defend themselves." There was a long pause on the other end. "You're right," the VP said quietly. "This is unacceptable," Jonathan continued. "I would like your team informed before landing." "Yes, sir," the VP replied quickly. Jonathan ended the call, placed the phone down, and breathed slowly. He didn't enjoy watching people lose their jobs, but he couldn't allow a system that judged passengers based on appearance to continue without consequences. The manager approached him again, her steps slow, her hands trembling slightly. "Sir, corporate contacted us," she whispered. "I know," Jonathan replied gently. She swallowed hard. They want us to cooperate fully with your instructions." Jonathan nodded. "Good," he said. "Cooperation leads to solutions." He stood up slowly, and the entire first-class cabin stiffened again. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence felt stronger now. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want to speak to your whole team one more time." The manager quickly gathered everyone, including attendants who worked in economy. Soon the front of the cabin was full, all eyes on him. Jonathan began with something they did not expect. He didn't scold them, didn't lecture them. He told them a story. "When I was 21, he said, I traveled to another city for my first job interview. The crew listened quietly. The receptionist looked at me and said, I didn't look like someone they were hiring. She refused to let me enter the building. She judged me before I even had a chance to speak." Jonathan looked at the 2 attendants who had judged him earlier. "That moment stayed with me," he said gently. "It shaped the kind of leader I wanted to be. It taught me the importance of treating people with respect." Even when they look ordinary, the attendants lowered their eyes. Shame filled their faces. Some of the other crew members looked emotional too. Jonathan continued, I don't want to punish people, he said. I want people to grow, but growth only comes after acknowledgement. He paused, letting the message settle. Then he asked a simple question. Do you understand what went wrong today? The manager stepped forward first. Yes, sir, she whispered. We judged you based on appearance. And that was wrong, the male attendant added quietly. We disrespected you. And we're sorry, the female attendant wiped her eyes. We should have treated you like any other VIP guest. Jonathan nodded. Thank you for admitting it, he said softly. But the matter was not over. Corporate had already taken action, and the consequences were going to unfold very soon. The plane continued climbing into the sky, but tension still hung in the air like a thin fog. The passengers watched quietly. The crew waited nervously, and Jonathan sat back down, knowing the next steps would change the future of this flight and, maybe even the airline itself. The plane leveled out smoothly above the clouds. But inside the cabin, nothing felt smooth at all. The crew stood stiff and nervous. Passengers sat quietly. And the atmosphere carried a strange tension mixed with curiosity. Everyone sensed that something bigger was coming, something that would shape the rest of the flight. Jonathan sat calmly in seat 1A. Sipping water, he wasn't angry. But he also wasn't relaxed. He was thinking, watching, and measuring the situation with the same sharp mind that built a billion-dollar company. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change, and he wanted honesty. Not just from others, but from the airline itself. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. This time the call wasn't from the vice president. It was from the airline CEO, the highest authority in the company's entire structure. Jonathan answered quietly. The crew watched from a distance. Exchanging worried glances, Jonathan, the airline CEO, said immediately, his voice tight with concern, "We just received your report and the cabin manager's confirmation." Jonathan leaned back, listening but not saying anything yet. "This is a serious failure on our part," the airline CEO continued. "And I take personal responsibility." Jonathan finally spoke. "I'm not looking for apologies," he said calmly. "I'm looking for accountability and improvement." There was a long pause on the other end. "We will take full action," the airline CEO said. "And I want you to know that whatever decisions you make on that aircraft will be supported by corporate." Jonathan's expression did not change. He looked out the window at the bright sky. "What I want," he said slowly, "is to make sure every passenger, no matter how they look, feels safe and respected on your flights." "You have my word," the airline CEO replied immediately. "We will fix this at every level." Jonathan ended the call quietly. He placed the phone on the tray table. Now it was time to close the matter. Not by shouting, not by embarrassing anyone, but by making a decision that would set a standard. He stood up again, and the manager quickly signaled the crew to gather. All attendants formed a semicircle in front of him, some nervously twisting their fingers, some swallowing hard. One of them looked close to tears. Passengers leaned in slightly, trying to follow every word without being obvious. Jonathan spoke softly, but the whole cabin could hear him. "Corporate has contacted me," he said. The crew stiffened instantly. "They support the decisions I make on this flight." The manager closed her eyes for a second, as if preparing herself for impact. The two attendants who mistreated Jonathan looked like they could barely stand, their breathing shallow, their thoughts racing. They knew the corporate call meant the situation was now official, and consequences were no longer avoidable. Jonathan looked at the crew slowly. "Before I continue," he said, "I want everyone to understand something. This is not just about what happened to me. It's about the kind of culture your airline creates. It's about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching." The words carried weight, the kind that settled deep inside a person. Some attendants lowered their heads. Feeling the truth of it, Jonathan continued, "You don't judge passengers by their clothes. You don't judge passengers by their skin. You don't judge passengers by your assumptions. You treat everyone with respect." There was no anger in his voice, only clarity, and that made his words feel even stronger. The passengers nodded silently, agreeing with every sentence. One elderly woman whispered, "Finally someone is saying it." Jonathan turned to the two attendants directly involved. "I asked corporate for one specific right," he said. The right to decide your positions on this flight. Their eyes widened in shock and fear. The cabin manager pressed her lips tightly. Holding her breath, Jonathan spoke slowly. I believe in accountability, but I also believe in teaching. The attendants looked confused. Unsure if there was hope or doom in his tone, then Jonathan continued. You will not continue working in first class today. Their shoulders fell instantly. You will assist in economy for the remainder of the flight. Their eyes lifted slightly. Still shaken, but relieved that they were not being removed mid-air. Jonathan then looked at the manager. And you, he said gently. You will spend the rest of the flight training the replacement lead attendant who will take your position after landing. The manager nodded slowly. She understood. This wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. She bowed her head slightly. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice heavy with humility. Jonathan continued addressing the full team. Corporate will decide long-term actions, he said, but on this flight, we will move forward with professionalism and respect. The moral tone in the cabin shifted. It felt calmer, lighter, almost hopeful. Passengers even breathed easier. Sensing fairness had returned, Jonathan returned to his seat, opened his laptop. The plane continued through the clouds peacefully. The crew walked back to their stations with quieter steps, ready to rebuild, ready to correct their mistakes, and ready for the next chapter that awaited them after landing. The atmosphere inside the plane slowly changed after Jonathan's decisions took effect. It no longer felt tense or cold. There was a quiet peace spreading through the cabin. Even the passengers who had been anxious earlier now sat back with more comfort. Some even smiled softly. As if relieved to see fairness take the lead, Jonathan reopened his laptop and continued reviewing his investor files. His fingers moved calmly over the keyboard. He was not thinking about the drama anymore. He was thinking about his work and the future meeting that mattered to thousands of people in his company. But every few minutes, he could feel eyes on him. Passengers watched him with quiet respect, not because he was a CEO, because he handled everything with dignity and strength. Meanwhile, the reassigned attendants walked toward the back of the plane. Their steps slow and heavy, the economy cabin crew looked surprised when they arrived. The manager explained the situation in a low voice. The two attendants simply nodded and began working. They were not used to the busier, noisier, more crowded environment of economy, but today they had no choice. Respect had to be learned the hard way. In first class, a new lead attendant arrived. A woman with calm eyes and a gentle manner, she introduced herself softly to the passengers. My name is Elise, and I'll be taking care of you for the rest of the flight. Her voice was warm and sincere. Within minutes, the cabin felt different, lighter. She moved with quiet confidence, showing the professionalism that had been missing earlier. Every now and then, Elise stole a glance at Jonathan. Not out of fear, but out of admiration. She had heard the story from the manager. She knew what had happened, and she knew this flight was going to be remembered within the entire company. As the flight continued, something unexpected happened. A man from Seat 1C stood up and approached Jonathan. He looked hesitant at first. Sir, he said quietly, may I speak with you for a moment? Jonathan looked up and nodded politely. The man cleared his throat. I want to thank you, said his voice low, for standing up the way you did. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Curious, the man continued. My brother was kicked off a flight last year because they assumed he couldn't afford his seat. There was no one to speak for him. He was humiliated. Jonathan listened with calm attention. I'm sorry that happened to him, he said gently. The man nodded, swallowing emotion today. You showed that people like us aren't invisible. Jonathan gave a small nod of understanding. Everyone deserves dignity, he replied quietly. The man returned to his seat with a lighter heart. And Jonathan returned to his laptop, but the moment stayed with him. It reminded him why he took action in the first place. A short while later, Elise approached Jonathan with a notebook in her hand. Sir, she said softly, corporate has emailed us. Jonathan glanced up. They want a statement from you before landing, she explained. Jonathan nodded slowly. I'll prepare one, he said. He opened a fresh document on his laptop. He didn't write out of anger, he wrote out of clarity. He wrote out of responsibility. He described the incident, the disrespect he faced, the attitude of the attendants, But he also described the efforts to correct it during the flight. He emphasized the importance of fairness. He highlighted the need for better training. He ended the statement with a simple line: "Respect is not optional." After finishing, he saved the file and closed the laptop. As he leaned back, he noticed something unusual. Passengers from all sections of the plane were coming forward one by one. Some only to nod, some to say thank you, some to share their own stories of similar treatment. It was not loud, it was not chaotic, it was simply human. Jonathan listened to each one with patience and kindness. He didn't dismiss their pain, he didn't rush them. He understood that sometimes people just needed to be heard. Far at the back of the plane, the reassigned attendants struggled through their tasks. They now faced passengers who needed constant help, children crying, overhead bins overflowing. Cramped aisles, it was a world very different from first class. But it was also a world where respect mattered even more. Every passenger watched how they behaved. Every mistake felt heavier now. Every rude look felt more dangerous. They began to understand something they had forgotten. People are not defined by their seat, or their clothing, or their assumptions. At the front of the plane, Jonathan felt the emotional shift. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, breathing steadily. He wasn't proud of what happened. He wasn't satisfied. But he felt a quiet certainty. Sometimes leadership meant stepping into a moment no one else wanted to handle. For the first time since the incident began, the cabin didn't feel tense. It felt hopeful. Something good was forming.
Ow!
Growth, awareness, change. But there was still more to come, because once the plane landed, a far bigger storm would begin, and the crew had no idea what awaited them on the ground. The captain's voice finally came over the speakers, warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly." Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened belts, and straightened up. But even with the routine announcement, something felt different in the cabin. There was a strange mix of calm and anticipation, almost as if everyone sensed the real story would begin after the plane touched the ground. Jonathan closed his laptop and placed it gently in his bag. He glanced around the cabin. The new lead attendant, Elise, gave him a respectful nod. She had worked with quiet excellence since taking over. Her presence alone helped restore balance to the flight. But Jonathan knew her shift was only part of the solution. The rest would happen the moment they reached the terminal. In the back of the plane, the reassigned attendants looked tired and overwhelmed. The economy cabin had tested them more than they expected. Every request, every complaint, every crying child, they felt the weight of every second. But hidden inside that exhaustion was a small spark of understanding. A lesson they had never wanted but clearly needed as the plane lowered through the clouds. Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered about what might happen next. Some wondered if airport security would be waiting. Others wondered if the airline executives themselves would show up. Jonathan simply breathed slowly. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel angry. He just felt ready. He knew the landing would bring answers. Decisions and consequences, not for him, but for the airline that allowed the disrespect to happen in the first place. When the wheels touched the runway, a soft murmur spread through the cabin. The plane slowed, the engines hummed down, the runway lights flashed past the windows. The moment felt important. Like the closing chapter before a new one began, after taxiing to the gate, the plane came to a full stop. But the doors did not open immediately. Instead, something unusual happened. The intercom came on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said slowly, "please remain seated for a moment." Passengers exchanged confused looks. Jonathan narrowed his eyes slightly. He already knew something unusual was waiting on the other side of the door. Suddenly, Elise approached Jonathan with a soft voice. "Sir, corporate has arrived," she whispered. "They're waiting at the jet bridge." Jonathan gave a slow nod. "Thank you," he said calmly, when the doors finally opened with a soft chime. The cabin manager stepped forward, nervous and pale. But before she could take a single step, 3 people entered the aircraft, 2 men and 1 woman, all in crisp business suits, their expressions serious, their eyes sharp, their presence unmistakable. They were senior executives from the airline. Passengers straightened in their seats. The cabin fell into complete silence. The entire crew stiffened immediately. The executives did not look left or right. They walked straight to Jonathan. "Mr. Hale," the woman said, her tone respectful. "I'm Miranda Collins, Chief Customer Officer. These are my colleagues from corporate operations." Jonathan nodded politely. "Thank you for coming," he said. Miranda took a deep breath. "First, on behalf of our airline, we offer our sincere apologies." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He watched her closely, wanting to see honesty. "Not performance," she continued. "We reviewed your messages, the manager's report, and the flight logs. What happened on this flight violates our standards. We take it extremely seriously." Passengers listened closely. Some even leaned forward in their seats. The tension in the cabin returned, but this time it was focused, not chaotic. Miranda glanced at the crew. Her eyes rested briefly on the two attendants who had mistreated Jonathan. Their faces dropped. They already knew this was the moment they feared. "Mr. Hale," Miranda said, "we are here to speak with you privately." "If you agree," Jonathan shook his head gently. "No need," he said. "Everything that happened took place in front of these passengers, and transparency is important." Miranda paused, then nodded slowly. "As you wish," she said. She turned toward the crew, her voice steady and official.
The attendants involved would be removed from duty immediately." Gas filled the cabin. The attendants' eyes widened with shock and defeat.
They looked like they wanted to speak, but no words came out. "The cabin manager," Miranda continued, "will be placed on administrative review." The manager lowered her head, respect and regret mixing in her expression. Then Miranda faced Jonathan again. "We would also like to invite you to help lead a new training initiative for our airline. Your guidance could change the way our staff interacts with passengers forever." The passengers stared in awe. Jonathan blinked once, surprised but thoughtful. He looked around the cabin, at the faces watching him, at the crew waiting for his response, at the company trying to correct its wrongs, and he made his decision. A decision that would echo far beyond this flight. A decision that would shape the next steps of the story. Jonathan stood in the center of the cabin, surrounded by silent passengers, nervous crew, and the airline's senior executives. Every eye watched him, every breath held. The cabin wasn't just quiet. It felt like the whole world had paused to hear what he would say next. The Chief Customer Officer, Miranda Collins, waited respectfully. Her hands folded, her posture straight. She looked like a woman ready to rebuild an entire airline system, if that's what it took. Jonathan could see sincerity in her eyes, not fear of his title, but respect for his principles. He finally spoke. "I don't want this to be about punishment," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I want it to be about change." Passengers nodded quietly. Feeling the truth in his words, the crew lowered their heads. Some out of guilt, some out of relief, some because they knew he was right. Jonathan continued. "People make mistakes," he said, "but mistakes become dangerous when no one learns from them." The statement hit the cabin like a gentle wave. Strong but not cruel, he turned toward the two attendants who mistreated him. Their eyes glistened, not from anger but from the weight of shame. They had never expected to be confronted by the very man they judged wrongly, and they certainly didn't expect him to speak with compassion instead of rage. Jonathan took a slow breath. "I don't want anyone fired," he said. Gasps echoed through the cabin instantly. Even Miranda looked surprised. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. Jonathan continued. "Removing people doesn't fix the system. Teaching them does." The attendants stared at him in confusion. They had expected the worst. They had feared the end of their careers. But here he was offering something no one predicted. He turned to Miranda. "You asked me to lead a training initiative," he said. "I'll agree. But under one condition." Miranda nodded attentively. "What condition, Mr. Hale?" She asked. "That every crew member involved today," he said, "must complete an intensive training on respect, empathy, and customer care before returning to first-class service." Miranda's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That is absolutely possible," she said. "In fact, we welcome it." Jonathan wasn't finished. "I also want this training," he added, "to become mandatory for all new employees and recommended for all existing staff." Miranda exchanged a quick glance with her colleagues. They nodded without hesitation. "We'll implement it," she said firmly. The passengers began whispering again. Not with tension now, but with admiration. Some smiled. Some wiped away small tears. It wasn't common to witness leadership so strong and so humble at the same time. Jonathan turned back to the attendants with a steady look. "I'm not excusing what happened," he said softly, "but I'm giving you a chance to grow." The male attendant swallowed hard and whispered, "Thank you." "Sir," his voice cracked as he spoke. The female attendant nodded repeatedly, tears finally falling. "We won't forget this," she whispered. "We'll do better." The manager stepped forward slowly. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, "I'm sorry for failing you and the passengers." Jonathan placed a gentle hand on the tray table beside him. Not touching her, but steadying the air. "Your mistake was serious," he said. "But your humility now matters too. You'll undergo training as well." She nodded with full acceptance. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I understand." Miranda took a deep breath and addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we thank you for your patience and for witnessing an important moment in our airline's history today. We begin a new chapter of fairness, respect, and accountability." Passengers clapped softly. A few people even stood up briefly to applaud Jonathan. But he raised his hand gently, asking them to stop. "This isn't about me," he reminded them. "It's about what all of us deserve as human beings." The mood in the cabin transformed completely. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't tense. It felt hopeful. Bright, renewed Miranda turned back to Jonathan. "Mr. Hale," she said, "we'd like to escort you to a private lounge for a formal discussion once we exit the plane." Jonathan nodded. "I'll come," he said. "But I want the crew to walk out first." The executives exchanged surprised looks. Jonathan explained, "They deserve to face this moment with dignity. No one should walk out in shame while hiding behind me." Those words hit the attendants deeper than anything else. And for the first time since the conflict began, they lifted their heads with a small sense of strength, one by one. The passengers stepped aside respectfully to let the crew pass. The attendants walked slowly, humbled but not broken. Changed but not destroyed, the cabin manager walked behind them. Her steps steady, her heart heavy but hopeful. Jonathan followed last, his presence calm. His footsteps steady, his principles unchanged. The story was not ending, it was only shifting into a new form. Because outside the jet bridge, a crowd waited, reporters, executives, staff, and cameras ready to capture the moment that would spread across the world. And Jonathan was ready to face it with the same dignity he carried inside the plane.